Welcome to our podcast. Today we have Bowen. We're going to be talking about open source software. Bowen, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, James. It's great being here. My name is Jovan Strika, and I'm a Chief Vision Officer of ElastaLink, and looking forward to hash through the new topics.
When I think about open source software, I think back to the day when it originally started as freeware, where people would distribute various pieces of software that they had in the internet. But we've come a long way since then. We now have different foundations which have open source repository. We have proprietary software producers actually contributing and interacting with those repositories. And indeed, they may even be the ones to start an open source repository. I know some of the big companies, the big software proprietary companies have started different repositories. And it's a really interesting ecosystem there where we have the big companies participating as well as other contributors to that software. And we have different licenses around the open source software. Now, maybe one of the things that I'd like to start by exploring is why this interest from big companies in open source software. What's the business model rationale for them to maybe start an open source initiative and contribute to it? It seems to me that putting the intellectual property out there for the wider community perhaps takes away from their own proprietary software. So what's the business model that we're seeing here?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and definitely there's a big shift on the market. We see that a lot of business models are kind of adapting to this new reality. We even see the businesses starting consciously by having open source as a main business model. And that's maybe another interesting question that start with a big why. Like what is the a long game there, and what is the objective? But one thing that we can definitely realize that things are moving much faster than it was before. Before you have a proprietary software opportunity to work on this for a couple of years, maybe even a year for testing before it was kind of released to the public. Today, pace is much faster. Companies cannot afford such a long process and still be market leaders. So it's a pressure to get things out the door, and certainly open source it can help contributing either internal testing or co-development. A lot of companies are consciously starting with the open source projects in order to gain contribution from others, as well as being able to identify some issues through the open source initiative rather than once it's production. So the big question why is it the savings? Is it the testing? And is there a strategy behind that open source? Meaning, do they plan to then evolve into the paid model that will eventually make that as a profitable model, or is just part of their development cycle?
We started off by talking about speed of development, and then you also alluded to the innovation and perhaps even the quality of the software. For an organization that is going to have an open source foundation or open source platform as their starting point, so we're not talking about big companies that are using this as part of proprietary or releasing proprietary into the open source community as a way of speeding development. But let's say a company right in its DNA is going to go open source, and we're seeing a number of different ones around, let's say, database, web browsers, et cetera, that are starting and continuing in the open source. Now, how do they structure their monetization of that? You alluded to that. You alluded to that a few moments ago, that an organization can start in the open source area and somehow monetize that. Obviously, they can't monetize the open source software itself because that's free license. Mm-hmm. What is it that they do? What are the options to try and monetize?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I would say a good example was Red Hat, which the whole model of introducing a Linux distribution and Linux being free. There was a lot of questions like what is the value, and they realized that a lot of companies will end up using Linux within their operation, but they need commercial support around the open source. And that's the kind of model that we now see evolved in many other businesses where the whole revenue is around commercial support of the open source project, as well as code development of or integration of open source component into the kind of production environment. We also see some of the companies introducing commercial plugins or extensions to the open source as something that then will allow them, besides of the ongoing support, create a bit of recurring revenue around enterprise grade add-ons and plugins that they might introduce. These are kind of two typical commercialization of the open source model that we saw in the market.
Let's take this down to the individual level. So we've got an open source repository and a platform working there. We can see how big proprietary companies might benefit. We can see how some companies might start an open source platform and benefit from the services that they put on top of that. What about the individuals who may be out there working on an open source? And I'm thinking of somebody who might be interested in a particular platform. They download the open source, they contribute it to it. There's a license agreement there, but they're not monetizing their individual efforts. Somebody who's working from home, for example, who adds a particular feature to a web browser, they may not be able to monetize that. And I've seen some interesting distributed monetization models or decentralized models in a variety of different creative arts or creative intellectual property fields. And are you also seeing that in the open source where somebody who writes code for an open source platform can somehow benefit from that on an individual basis?
Oh, absolutely. Just a recent one that comes to my mind is the development framework called Vue.js. In the development ecosystem, there's several frameworks introduced by larger groups like Google and Facebook. Google supports the Angular, which is the framework for development. Facebook also has its own. And then Vue.js is the project that started by an individual who was actually working at the time at Google and realized that there might be a way to create a different approach to the problem and literally publish some ideas online as here is my view to how this can be done. And in a matter of 2 years, that involved to the project now has multiple contributors, several conferences, and it's now in pair to Angular, React, JS, and other large frameworks that are completely backed up by a lot of commercial players. So it was a really interesting story because it's probably one of the fastest open source project that I saw from individual just publishing some ideas to something that is now so dominant in the market. And where he's personally benefiting is the really good question, because currently Vue.js has no business model behind, at least not visible directly or published and marketed directly. But we see a lot of larger enterprises using that framework for their own internal applications. And as soon as they look into integrating open source platform, that becomes a big question. Is that open source project mature? Who will be able to support it? What is the business goal of that open source project? Will that become closed source? What if it's acquired by somebody else? That brings a lot of questions how it will impact the business projects who are using open source down the road. A good question to ask when you decide to use the open source. But at least currently with the Vue.js, I don't see exactly the model yet, how they're going to monetize. But certainly they're open for custom development. And that's probably one of the first ways to personally monetize. There's a donations that he was asking in the beginning. If I want to, let my job with Google go, and I kind of need to focus full time, I welcome the sponsors, and that's how he started supporting himself in order to focus 100%, and then as he went get other contributors to the project.
Let me just explore that in a little more detail, because you pretty much sketched out the picture. But if we have a researcher or an academic, a scientist who comes up with a new scheme, a new kind of software, writes the concept papers on it, but doesn't actually get involved in the foundation, doesn't actually get involved with writing the software, I'm kind of wondering what their motivation is.
Yeah, it's funny, as we were kind of engaging with the different groups, the reasoning behind going in the open source comes from a different direction. Some of them was like, well, I really don't have a time to involve my idea, but by releasing the open source, I can attract others. And sometimes it's a bit of a unexperienced approach, because it reminds me to the businesses who are, deciding to start offering their service and think by just, making themselves available and having a product to sell, suddenly, customers will find them and be interested. So the open source is demanding as a model, and a lot of people have to understand that you need to show commitment for yourself before others will be even willing to participate. If you are doing this just as I have a couple of weeks free time and let me put something and make it available online, but there is no commits, there is no contribution continuous, you don't answer on the issues, people don't get response, very easily you get that negative position on open source, and therefore it won't get to the next level. So getting open source, depending on what your objective is just sharing the code and whoever can use it, and you don't expect anything else from it. That can be very simple, but if you're really thinking to get it to the next level, commitment is important.
I want to explore where this idea of open source can go from here, because so far our examples have all been around software, but the concept of coming up with an idea and having other people use that idea to innovate further, and then creating a repository or a knowledge base, and using that to monetize it in different ways, that concept itself is applicable to other fields. We've seen open source in the hardware area. Are you seeing this open source idea migrate into other industries and other kinds of creative intellectual property development? Is this a framework for let's say, going forward in the 21st century as a way to capture innovation and creativity from a broad number of people and create these knowledge bases which are open to all?
Absolutely, and I think it is an emerging trend. You brought up a great question about the open source in, for example, hardware. There is a few initiative of that whole open hardware standards and approaches, especially when it comes to now data centers and evolution of the whole cloud, where optimized hardware and power usage and how to do this effectively is a part of the research. Is breaking down the typical server design, for example. We see also in for example 3D printing several initiative of that resource exchange. designs that are uploaded and publicly available for anybody who has a 3D printer. You can find quite a lot of designs for free. Download them, and in a matter of a few minutes, have a product printed. And we see that also now getting into some specific verticals, from automotive industry to some other products that as 3D printer is growing, we can see that across different verticals as well. But absolutely, that whole concept of sharing knowledge for free and contributing, we see interest. The question always comes down is, is it sustainable? Whoever is contributing, and there is no business model behind it, and very often I'm wondering, can the updates and upgrades and continuous support be there if there is no commercialization attached to it, just because it's not sustainable in that case. So as long as somebody is kind of more on a amateur level interested, then it's okay. But if they're looking to integrate this in their own business and risking their business by integrating open source, then it's a very different decision process, what it makes sense.
It might be that for when we think of product designs on 3D printers, it may be that somebody wants to create a product design and allow it to be used for free because they want either the publicity or the fame associated with it, or it's integrated or integratable into a larger portfolio of products. And this is just the freemium version of it, and then to upscale to the more paid version of it. So you can think of a number of different business models there. Is maybe something that we'll see in the future is open source being used in other areas as a way of grabbing that market share and then figuring out how to monetize it later. I mean, we saw this in social media, where in the early days it was all about getting the users and that network effect, and then later on they tried to figure out how to monetize it. Perhaps we'll see something similar to that with open source propagating into other industries.
Absolutely, and you brought up a good point. Another area that I wanted to mention is electronics. And if you look at the Raspberry Pi as a small board that thinkers are able to kind of play with, one of the success to the Raspberry Pi model is actually releasing a lot of type of schematics and software that can turn that board into so many different things, from the media players to robots to the media streamers, and all of this are kind of definitely indirectly contributed sales of that product, and now just everybody kind of pick it up, and it's not anymore initiative by the board manufacturer, but they certainly created an ecosystem that was very unique when it comes to small boards.
Okay, as we come to the end of our podcast, do you have any takeaways for our listeners?
Yeah, so as somebody who is using open source in our own business, we realize that we need to look at very carefully when we decide what we would like to use, and especially if we're committing service to the customers, how mature the open source is, how supportive is from the vendor. Try to understand the trend, because we made also mistake in some cases where we committed and it was just not supported, and we ran into issue and we could not really get help. So my takeaway is definitely for the business owners who are considering using open source, to go through a bit of checklist and make sure before they rush into here's something free, let's use it. There are strings attached, and there is a commitment. You might need to have resources to continue supporting that if that's not done by community. These decisions are important to do in the beginning rather than later.
Okay, thank you very much for joining us to talk about open source and business models around it.
Thank you, James, for having me.